My name is Florence Reed. I'm a producer and presenter at Unheard. I'm here today to talk to Phillip about the covenant, society, the increasingly fractured nature of young people, particularly the atomization of individuals, and how we might be able to move forward into a better world.
Creating a freer society.
Phillip, it's good to be with you.
Good to be here.
When you first asked me to come on, I did wonder slightly maybe what use I would be to you, because I don't have a particularly economic brain. I, in fact, failed all of my maths exams at school. So I'm not one of Rishi's star pupils, I guess, these days. But I suppose thinking more about your thinking and where you're coming to these economic issues from, the thing that stood out to me as really interesting was the spiritual element of covenant. And I just wanted to know a bit more about how you came to land upon this spiritual word, which does feel, although similar in meaning, so different in effect to something like contract. How did it appeal to you initially, and how did you find yourself there?
It's interesting. It started a few years ago where I was reading, I was running a business. I wanted to convert it into a social enterprise because I'd realised that business has lost its mojo, it's lost its purpose. And so I tried to convert Cord into a social enterprise. And we're thinking about the values and the beliefs of the company. And I read quite a lot of Lord Sachs, and he talks about covenant a lot. And then I met with a political advisor whose name escapes me. But anyway, he said, and I said to him, look, what about from contract to covenant? And he said, yes. He didn't hesitate. He said, there's something that will have wide appeal, that people recognise there's something missing from society. And so he said to me, it's the right set of values. And I haven't let go since then. So it came from a discussion, a chance discussion. And I think it is critical. I think you're right. And by the way, you talk about the fact that you're not particularly scientific or mathematical. It's more important to me to talk to people who are not, because I don't want to only talk to the elites. I want to, not that you're not elite.
I don't feel very elite. Mathematically, I'm definitely not elite.
No, it's got to work for everybody. And I think we're too focused on gamekeepers and the gatekeepers, I should say. So we actually keep the layman out by making things too complicated. And if we're going to change the world, you have to talk to everybody. And accountants are gatekeepers, and lawyers. Politicians.
They tend to be quite technocratic and mathematical in their approach. Many of these kind of gatekeepers, as you call them.
It gives them power. Because
they
feel superior, because no one can really know what they're talking about. And they like it that way, because they don't probably know what they're talking about either, without being overly critical. So
we have got that sense over the last few months that there might be some people at the very top echelons of society who think that they can read the markets in a way that's amazingly mystical, and they've got some incredible insight. And in actual fact, it turned out that they didn't have that much of an insight. And
absolutely
they
right.
just had a load of spreadsheets that weren't right in the end.
Correct. And therefore it's key, if there are 7 billion people, and I want to talk to as many of those as possible via faith, and it's 3.5 to 4 billion of faith, it has to be without jargon. And therefore anything that is not clear when I talk to you, please challenge me, because I want to make sure that the message is jargon free.
Well, faith does seem to appeal to people still, even in what we consider a kind of scientific age. Everyone talks about us being in a kind of post-Darwinian society that values science, post-Enlightenment science and rationalism more than they do the irrational, faith-based, or the idea of some ineffable life. But actually, when you speak to people, you realise that is actually not true. We've been sold an idea that society would be better run by technocrats and on the basis of rational science. And in actual fact, when you speak to a normal person, they tend to organise their lives, their everyday life, their family life, the most important things in their life, around faith and hope. It doesn't have to be religious.
No, agreed. It doesn't have to be. It has to be inclusive. But we're all looking for meaning and purpose. And I think that trust, what's missing is, what's my life about? And because of the crazy inflation and unequal distribution of assets that we've had for so many years, people, the young especially, are having to readjust their expectations, because they can't own homes now. They can't find meaningful jobs easily. And therefore they're having to adjust their aspirations based on a world which is unfair. And I think that's right. So everybody, I think what ties us together is this search for meaning, and that's not money. Meaning is purpose, is faith. It's caring for others. It's looking after other people's needs before my wants. These kind of ideas, which are simple, but change lives. Because and I think that's you're absolutely right. Meaning is right at the heart of this.
They're not also particularly rational choices in many cases. They can be choices based on a kind of love that does not have bounds of science or reason. It is kind of unreasonable, perhaps deeply kind of irrational in many ways. And that's what I think lots of people realize now, is that those elements of our daily lives are not being appreciated by the people who are running our lives. And so there does seem to be, especially with young people, perhaps we'll talk more about this, a drive towards actually moving away from taking their social cues from the state and trying to find some way to live, as you say, a search for meaning. What am I living for? Those sort of questions seem to be popping up more and more for people younger than I am, I think. Yeah. And they seem to be answering them by saying, well, look, I can't actually take a lead from the people in charge, because those technocratic entities just do not have the soul that I want to exhibit in my everyday life. They're seeing things that don't reflect the kind of natural irrational and the natural passion of everyday human life. Just to return back to the very, very beginning, because I think it's important. It's important for me as well to get a sense of how contractual existence and covenant-based existence differ, and how a society based on covenant would actually be different to our current kind of market-led contractual society. Could you just explain a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think whether it's the market or the state, both are controlling, either planning by the state, where the laws are passed and we're told what to do and how to spend our money, and they're trying to control minutiae, which they can't control. As you say, we've seen this over the last few months. They're not as brilliant and far-seeing as they think they are. And then the market does the same thing. The market is trying to force you to behave in a certain way using technology to almost take decision-making power away from social media. Doesn't encourage thought, and most of it is trying to predict and control, to try and focus which one of these platforms can actually control you more and actually make more money for the platform by predicting control. So effectively, what Covenant is doing is letting go. It's not controlling from the center. It's allowing people to make their own choices. And trust then develops, because if you're not being forced by the market or by the state to behave in a certain way, you suddenly are genuinely liberated. But we're not talking about anarchy here. We're talking about liberation around a meaning and purpose. You've got to care for others. You've got to care for the planet. Purely letting people go without giving them a moral obligation will not achieve the desired outcome. So you let people go, you distribute responsibility to the community, to the family, to build community, etc. But you then set morality and values, which then make it meaningful. Because if it's purely about freedom without morality, then it's meaningless.
I don't want to go all kind of kids these days, especially because a lot of these people are kind of my own peers. But it does seem to be a sense in which an erring towards freedom, more liberation, more, I don't know, being unchained from an idea of how you ought to behave. And these predictive models of behavioral control, which are so sinister, and people have, I think, an innately kind of disgusted response to, actually. Most people do not like the feeling of not having free will. They just don't like it. Even if that's just simply predictive advertising online, that means that they never see anything that's not entirely catered to their tastes. I think most people actually find this disagreeable. However, there does seem to be this shift towards a kind of, as you say, anarchic form of libertarian living, which has hollowed out any idea of social responsibility, and even more so than social responsibility, I would say, because in many ways that might be best left to the state, if you argue that way. Personal responsibility to your very small community, whether that's family or the kind of village. That's feels that it's not being rehabilitated by young people at the moment. How can we encourage people who might have deep skepticism about the idea of the family unit or the small living, the village life. How do we encourage them to look closer to home and think about social responsibility as an element of kind of everyday social cohesion?
Yeah, the only way of doing it is actually showing that it works. So in business, we talk about agile development. So these ideas sound big and complicated, but you can't start by changing the whole world in one fell swoop. So what you have to do is create almost test environments, many of them, where you actually start to build the kind of society that you're talking about. So where you start to show people, because people, I think, only really believe when they see it with their own eyes. If I lecture to you, it's hard because you don't believe me, because well, you would say that. But if you actually create those modern environments where we start to look at maybe the free ports that Michael Gove was talking about, and you start to say, okay, let's create 15 of them. Let's start to actually create a society where the family is allowed to grow, where community is allowed to grow, where we create civic trusts, which are organizations focused on purpose and not shareholders, and focus on other people's needs before my wants. What would actually happen in that model? And when you start to see the kind of society that we built, then suddenly people say, oh, wow, this works. The key model, you have to do it, and you have to get people involved. So I think the way you change it is by actually testing, creating loads of models around the country. The UK is in a perfect place. We're out of Europe, and therefore we're free from European legislation. And therefore we can now actually experiment. We're in Ireland, and change does come from the UK. If you look at the Industrial Revolution that happened here, why? We're in Ireland, we're free thinking, we got this the expertise, and it can happen from here again.
Do you mean practically, pilot schemes? Are we talking actually trying out these ideas on a real level?
You have to have a number of simultaneous trials, and you really, that's what I think Michael Gove should be doing, and I think he is doing it. And you've got to give scope to each area. You've got to let go. And I think Michael does recognise this. He's saying that he doesn't want the decisions about which projects are back to be made at central government, which is right. You distribute it. So you give pots of value creation and money creation to the local communities and let them go and almost ring fence them so that they're not contaminated by alien ideas, and be amazed what you'll see happening. And I think that's the way you can actually turn this into a reality.
I suppose the problem there, the thing that you've immediately hit up against, is that the power brokers, who are much more globalized in many ways, they are less localized to a kind of British economy. They're not particularly interested in the village shop, let's say in Grimsby. They have a great stake in not really letting this happen, not letting people turn inward. The way they'll sell it to people, of course, is that you want to look outward, you want to be, a global village that is constantly connected up to hundreds of other countries and billions of other people through this massive economy. But how can we convince, or do we not need to convince them, in fact? Do we need to work against them? We were speaking about Thomas Fazzi earlier. He writes about this a lot. Is there actually an argument for saying there does need to be a slightly anarchic element to this, in that it needs to reject the power brokers who will try to convince us otherwise and will try to, put their foot on the neck of any attempt to allow people to self-govern or create kind of micro communities that would be in some form a rebellion against the idea of the global economy?
Absolutely right. No, again, the Bible, I was toying with this idea, and Thomas Fazzi's ideas actually helped me to realize the answer here. The Bible has a verse which in Hebrew says, "Lanochri tashich," when it's talking about extraction, and we translate it wrongly as interest, but it's actually abuse of power. And it says you're not allowed to abuse power within the local community, but there is a case where people's ideas are alien. The word is nochri, which means alien ideas, where it actually says bite them, literally keep them out, because it's self-preservation. Because what you're quite rightly saying is that the powers that be are globalizing. Now, they say that's freedom. Yeah, you allow people to do what's in their best interest, but it's not going to work, because that's what's created the massive deindustrialization of the UK and America, is because we've allowed the freedom, allegedly, of the capitalist to do whatever he wants. He does not care about the family and the community and about his local area. All he cares about is himself. He then goes and takes the jobs, puts them in China in the Far East, takes the industry and doesn't care about that. And that is unless you start to address that actually and say, look, I'm going to keep these people away, you're not going to be able to create the environment. So you've got a ring fence. The ring fencing is from those alien ideas, but then you create love free of contamination from alien ideas. And the Bible actually says you're allowed to do, which is almost biting these people, because it's self-preservation. They're trying to kill you. Because if jobs go to China, if we try to bring those back, that's going to create massive inflation, because the labour rates are lower in China. In the UK and the US, we've allowed property prices to be escalated, which means it costs a huge amount to employ people here, which means that if we try to bring jobs back without the kind of ring fencing that we're talking about, we're going to have massive inflation, which is what we're starting to see. And therefore, you do have to keep out those contaminating values to allow you to have a safe environment where you build, and then you free people up, combine that with morality, with caring for the other, with caring for the planet. And by the way, the whole global warming thing will not be addressed unless we do something like this, because you can't do it. If we continue with the current contamination, we're playing with it. It's just not happening. It needs a restart, a fresh start.